So good morning, and again, welcome to the online conference on the challenges of CLIL. Let me just justify in advance that we waited 15 minutes because actually the number of people attending here doesn't match the number of enrolled people in a very large number, if I may say so. So I was having the expectation of having people joining us before we started, but probably during the presentation they will do so. So thank you for your patience. So I'll start by giving you a bit of the scope of this conference, as it is in the context of a project named Language Development Through Digital Tools. And the aim of this project is to develop practical classroom skills to teach CLIL and show effective techniques when teaching learners whose mother tongue is not the medium of instruction, as well as promote teaching content in cross-curricular platform. On this conference, so the name of the conference, so we've been challenged to decide on which would fit best, and together as a team we decided that the challenges of CLIL would fit the discussion taking place during the conference. So in the context of the conference, we will be delivering a presentation of the project outcomes and results. This will be my colleague Anabela Mateus, who's also a speaker and a moderator for this conference. And then the context and conditions for successful CLIL in Portugal, presenting applied research experience in schools and in higher education, using cognitive discourse functions to integrate content and language in classroom teaching and assessment. And then there will be also time for debating the topics and the presentations being delivered by our speakers, and of course the closing remarks. So I'm Ana Cunha. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, which is a huge mistake. So I'm very interested in researching this topic on CLIL, but mostly my research so far was based on English for specific purposes with my colleague. So we've been working together for the past, well, let's not say how long, but more or less 2 decades on that. So we've been working together and publishing together on English for specific purposes. I'm also the executive director for the research and development department, which is supporting research activities from the overall Lusófona group. And in a few minutes, I will be having the chance to introduce a bit of what has been done in Lusófona and what Lusófona represents in fact. Then Anabela Mateus, as I said, a researcher and also a professor at Lusófona University. She will have her own chance to introduce herself a bit further. Okay, Anabela? And thank you so much for the hard work in this conference, in organizing the conference. Then our colleague Margarida Morgado, thank you once again for accepting our invitation. So Margarida is a researcher and coordinating professor at Polytechnic Institute of Castelo Branco. Then Anabela will be speaking a bit more on the research interests from Margarida. Thank you again, Margarida. Tom Morton is a distinguished research fellow in the Department of English Studies, and he's currently working as a lecturer and researcher at Universidade Autónoma de Madrid. So now a bit about Lusófona University. So last year we decided to merge Lusófona from Porto and Lusófona from Lisbon, which was, from my perspective, something that was made with a bit of delay, because actually our mission objectives and the owners and representatives of both institutions are exactly the same. So we decided to merge. There's only one Lusófona University with 2 campuses, one located in Porto and another one in Lisbon. And the team here representing Lusófona University actually is based in the campus in Lisbon. So currently, considering that we merged Porto and Lisbon, we have over 16,000 students, over 1,600 teachers. We are organized in different faculties, schools, and institutes, and we are now 15, so covering a large number of scientific domains. We currently offer 65 undergraduate programs, 70 master degrees, 4 integrated master degrees, 8 Erasmus Mundus Masters, so funded in the scope of the Erasmus Plus project, so direct funding from European Commission. We have 2 professional masters, 13 PhD programs, a wide offer of specialization graduate programs, specialized training, and micro-credential courses. All this makes us the largest private university in Portugal. We've been building a path to excellency, as I may call it, and I would like to introduce some of the figures which support that. We are the leader of Filmeo, so an European University for Film and Media Arts, which is a great achievement. I have a bit of a cold, which influences, in fact, my pronunciation. My apologies for that. So this is a great achievement because actually this was the first European university funded by the European Commission, led by a Portuguese institution, and that makes us very proud, of course. In that scope, we have over 1,700 international students, and from those, we have 84 different nationalities. Of course, this is all supported by our 14 research units, where we have over 400 researchers. Currently, we have 53 ongoing research projects funded by a diversity of funding programs, be it European, international, or even national. Those are only some examples, so Erasmus Plus, Horizon, and the Foundation for Science and Technology. So this last one being the Portuguese agency for funding research activities in Portugal. So we decided just to bring to stage some of our projects, language related. This first slide has a set of projects which actually have been completed. So eventually, if you're interested in getting to know a bit more details on some of the projects, we will be sharing this PowerPoint presentation, and you only have to follow the link. From that slide onwards, this is just a short list on some of other projects which are still actually ongoing. I would like to focus mostly, if you don't mind, in this last one. See me, hear me. Actually, it's media literacy and languages related. It foresees and has as objective the integration of migrants in the countries which compose actually the consortium. We are quite proud of this project because it's the first project that we are leading, so funded by the Portuguese National Agency. I would like to ask you to follow us on the social media to keep track on further developments and interesting outputs that we are very eager to share with all of you. Thank you very much for your attention. I will now invite Anabela Mateus to take the floor. Hope you enjoy the interesting topics which will be approached during the conference. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here today with us. It's a great pleasure to have you here for this session. Welcome, Professora Margarida. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So my name is Anabela Mateus, as my colleague has already mentioned. I've been an assistant professor at Universidade Lusófona for quite a long time, and I've been working with Anna. We have been a team for many years now, especially dedicated to researching English for specific purposes. As Anna was saying, we were very excited about this project because beforehand we didn't know a lot about CLIL, and so this was like a great opportunity to learn and to have more information on CLIL. And it has been a pleasure to work in this project. I know that we have some of our partners here with us today, and I would like to welcome them as well, and saying them that it has been a pleasure to work with everybody involved in this project. So the name of the project, as my colleague said, is Language Development Through Digital Tools. We will share this presentation, and we have there the link for the project website if you want to discover more about the project. So this was a project that lasted for 2 years. It started in June 2021, and it will finish at the end of this month, so in 2 weeks, more or less. The partners in this project were institutions from Finland, Turkey, Czech Republic, Romania, Sweden, and of course us, the hosts for this conference. So the main objectives of this project were several, namely to improve the competencies of our foreign language teachers with an interdisciplinary approach in language development, to improve the foreign language development, digital skills and competencies of all educators, students, and all other people that may have access to the results of the project, to increase the efficiency of language teaching and learning by systematically supporting the introduction of innovative methods such as bilingual teaching and the use of digital tools in our own institutions, which have been like seeing a great progress, especially due to the pandemic that we have had recently, to improve the cultural awareness of our teachers in our own institutions, and to develop our own teachers' professional competencies in CLIL, as well as to try to disseminate this knowledge to other people involved in teaching and learning scenarios. Among the activities carried out under the project, I would like to highlight 3 training activities which were very important and which gave us the opportunity to discuss together as a team and to increase our knowledge and to develop, obviously, our results in a further stage. So the first training was held by our Czech partners in Czech Republic in November 2021, and it was fully dedicated to CLIL. So it was like a kickoff training, which was really, I had the opportunity to participate in this training, and it was very interesting, very important. This training comprised 15 modules that covered many different topics related to CLIL, from things like benefits and risks of CLIL, language showers, examples of CLIL lessons, CLIL activities across the primary school curriculum, classroom materials and CLIL resources, CLIL in secondary schools, scaffolding strategies, how to prepare a good CLIL lesson, English for classroom management, ICT in CLIL, assessment in CLIL. So these are some of the examples that were focused and that we had the opportunity to work along with many practical activities. So it was really, especially for me, that, as I mentioned, I didn't know many things about CLIL. It was like a fantastic opportunity. Then in March 22, it was our turn to host a training activity in our university, which was fully dedicated to MOOC, because as I'm going to show you a bit further on, we built a MOOC, a massive open online course dedicated to CLIL. And so during this training in Portugal, we had the opportunity to get information and knowledge about how to build a massive online open course. So from the basics of the platform to more technical details. So this was like a more technical kind of training. And finally, the third activity, training activity, was held in Sweden in May 2022. and it was dedicated to implementing CLIL pedagogy and didactics. And we had the opportunity to work in a school with our Swedish partners and obviously with other partners of the project. And it was basically a week dedicated to the practical side of CLIL. So we had the opportunity of being students, teachers being students for a week in a CLIL context, developing and taking part in practical activities that served as examples of CLIL lessons. And we also had the opportunity to discuss about the development of lesson plans for CLIL learning scenarios. Now, the results of the project, we produced two outputs. The first one was a MOOC. You have the link to the course there. This MOOC focuses on CLIL, and it tends to provide the educators with an understanding of this method and guide them through the process of designing effective CLIL lesson scenarios. The course comprises 4 modules. The first one is an introduction to CLIL, a short introduction to CLIL. Module 2 is dedicated to contextualizing and enhancing integration with technology. The third module focuses on examples of integrated CLIL teaching and learning scenarios. And the fourth module, create your learning scenario. And the second result is a digital lesson plans book, which is a collection of lesson plans that we prepared, and that include these lesson plans, different activities that can be used in different subjects. And the aim is to improve content learning and language competence. And they cover many different subjects and different levels of teaching. And this is what we've done in our project. I thank you very much for your attention. And I don't know if anyone wants to make a comment or ask any questions before we move on.
I would like to say about the booklet that we made. The booklet is in all languages that are from the partner countries.
You are right, Preeti. Thank you very much. Preeti is our Swedish partner. Hello, Preeti. Thank you for that piece of information that I didn't mention. Obviously, our MOOC is in English, but the lesson plan, as Preeti was saying, was translated into all the languages of the countries involved in the project.
There's no other comments or questions. I think we can move forward, right?
Yes, I think so. So once again, thank you, Professora Margarida. So it's now my turn to introduce Professora Margarida in more detail. We thank you for being here once again. Professora Margarida Morgado is a coordinating professor at Polytechnic Institute of Castelo Branco, the School of Education in the Department of Social and Human Sciences. She is also the coordinator of the Technical Scientific Unit of Social and Human Sciences, director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Languages, Cultures and Education, and a researcher at SETAPS, New University of Lisbon and University of Porto, where she is part of the Working CLIL Research Strand. She is a member of the COST network CLILnet LE. I'm not sure whether I'm saying this correctly or not.
Okay.
And she was the national coordinator for the Erasmus Plus funded projects CLIL for Children and CLIL for Young European Citizens, and also for the INCOLAB project on interdisciplinary learning and teaching through collaborative approaches in higher education. And today, Professora Margarida is going to talk about the contexts and conditions for successful CLIL in Portugal. presenting applied research experience in schools and in higher education. And now I give you the floor, Professora Margarida. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I start sharing my PowerPoint, which makes it very impersonal, I just like to thank you for inviting me to share what I know about CLIL and to learn with others about CLIL. It's always a pleasure. So let me share my PowerPoint and see if it works online.
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you. So this is the title for what I want to talk to you about today: context and conditions of successful CLIL in Portugal. So there will be 3 parts to my talk, and please shut me up if I overdo my time, because I tend to run on these things forever. So please feel free to interrupt me if I've done my 30 minutes. So I will start with a little bit of context about my recent work, co-published with colleagues, as well as on my perspective or our perspective on context for CLIL. And I do think that many people share different ideas of what CLIL is and the context in which it can be applied. So it's good to, at the start, tell you where I am. Then I will share our exploratory research on mapping the CLIL terrain in Portugal, which was published in 2022. And finally, I will touch on some recommendations for CLIL implementation, taken from some contributors to the volume that we edited. And I think some conclusions will come up at the end, and I'm glad if you ask me questions and if we can discuss some of these things. So, as Annabella said, I work at, I conduct research. I work at the Polytechnic University of Castelo Branco, but I conduct research at the working CLIL strand of TILs within setups. Our objective is to address core issues in CLIL bilingual education in Portugal, CLIL teacher profiles, assessment of students, quality assurance in projects. We provide also an extensive range of information on bilingual education in Portugal. We keep an updated list of the members and collaborators' publications on bilingual education CLIL. And we have a rich collection of resources that everybody is welcome to explore. So videos, lesson plans, tutorials on bilingual education in CLIL. And additionally, we organize international conferences on bilingual education, as well as numerous seminars. The upcoming Working CLIL conference, which is the 3rd edition, it's the 3rd international colloquium, is in Porto. It will be held this July on the 13th and the 14th. You can see the link there for the conference, and you're all invited to come and be with us in this conference, in this colloquium. Now, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, Maria Ellison and Margarida Coelho, with whom I have co-authored this volume that just came up on the screen, Context and Conditions for Successful CLIL in Portugal. It's a bilingual volume in Portuguese and English that gives you insight to what is happening in Portugal. It offers best practice reports. It maps CLIL in Portuguese schools, and it also includes a very short chapter on interviews with several stakeholders in Portugal that could move CLIL forward. So our goal is for this book to serve as an educational resource for policymakers, for teacher educators, for school teachers, for higher education lecturers, teacher education researchers. So it maps CLIL, it presents best practice from pre-primary to higher education. It addresses pre-service and in-service teacher education for CLIL. It offers policy recommendations for CLIL implementation and highlights the necessary conditions for successful CLIL implementation in Portugal. Okay, so one important aspect that I would like to mention is that at Working CLIL research trend, we view CLIL as being connected to linguistic and methodological change. And these changes include shifting the focus from learning English or any other foreign language to using them for communicative purposes and conveying various types of content. The other shift is we emphasize the use of foreign language for communication rather than solely learning about the language. CLIL, in a technologically enhanced learning environment, as I see is the one that you at Lusófona are developing, focuses on teaching students on how to use the foreign language to communicate content effectively. So we promote, I think we think CLIL promotes an interdisciplinary approach by enhancing collaboration between language and content teachers, thereby facilitating integrated approaches. And it needs to adopt a student-centered approach, where CLIL advocates for learning as a participatory co-construction of meaning among teachers and students, and also fostering projects that involve real-life situations and using all the linguistic repertoires of users. So these linguistic and methodological changes are connected also, in our view, to demographic, cultural, and political shifts, where education strives to strike a balance between traditional roles and emerging societal needs. And some of the tensions arising from these shifts include the need for individuals to be proficient in their own mother tongue, at least 2 additional languages, and I think a lingua franca for international communication in an increasingly globalized world. The requirement for intercultural mediation skills due to the heightened voluntary or enforced mobility of peoples across the globe. Also, the progressive internationalization of higher education, necessitating students' ability to function and to learn in plurilingual environments. And the growing interconnectedness in education, technological interconnectedness, I mean, which expects Generation Z to utilize their technological skills for effective learning, requiring teachers to guide them accordingly. So the focus for this talk is the implementation of content and language integrated learning in Portuguese educational contexts, and specifically I will discuss the significance of teacher professional development in relation to CLIL. So I will begin by sharing insights from our research study titled CLIL Across Schools in Portugal, which we conducted and published in the edited volume I mentioned before, and that you see on the screen. And so this exploratory study aimed to map the CLIL landscape in Portugal and shed light on its current status. And furthermore, I will offer recommendations for effectively implementing CLIL within the Portuguese context, and this may be borrowed by other contexts or not. And all these recommendations have been derived from the contributions made to this volume. And by considering these suggestions, I hope to share strategies to move forward and enhance CLIL practices in Portugal. So this was my big introduction. So let's move on to the real thing. So the initial phase of our ongoing exploratory study within the Working CLIL research strand involves mapping the landscape of CLIL bilingual education of schools in Portugal. And our primary objective was to provide insights for teachers, policymakers, student teachers, researchers, enabling them to gain an understanding of the current state of CLIL implementation. And as researchers, we wanted to focus on 2 main things. Our first focal point was to examine the extent to which CLIL has been implemented in Portuguese schools beyond the official ministry program called PEBI. We aim to provide a comprehensive understanding of the scope and depth of CLIL practices in various educational settings. So our second focal point was to investigate the provision and nature of continual professional development opportunities for teachers. We explored Erasmus-funded projects, staff mobility training, and accredited in-service teacher education programs. And we wanted to shed light on the support systems available for teachers in enhancing their CLIL experience. So, in terms of methods, to address our first focal point, we distributed an online questionnaire to all school clusters, as well as non-clustered public and private schools, and we covered mainland Portugal, Madeira, and the Açores, so ensuring a comprehensive overview of CLIL practices throughout the country. And additionally, we conducted research on official data provided by the PEBI bilingual program, which is the official program. So there are some limitations here. From the responses we only got 130 responses. While they are insightful for what we wanted to explore, but they do not fully represent the overall landscape of CLIL implementation in schools. So to address our second focal point, which concerned the provision and nature of continual professional development for teachers, we employed various research methods. Firstly, we conducted web-based research utilizing the Erasmus Plus database for the period 2016-2021. It revealed a total of 208 Erasmus Plus funded projects involving Portuguese partner organizations. Among these projects, 44 were coordinated by Portuguese organizations. And we thoroughly examined the summaries of these projects to gain insights into the nature of their activities. And furthermore, we explored the website of the Conselho Científico-Pedagógico de Formação Contínua, specifically focusing on accredited teacher development courses related to CLIL in Portugal. And we identified 22 in-service teacher education opportunities dedicated to CLIL and bilingual education that were available between 2016 and 2021. And additionally, we discovered 7 training courses and workshops within this database aimed at improving the English skills of teachers, school teachers, I mean. So by utilizing these research methods, I think we obtained some insights into the provision and availability of professional development opportunities related to CLIL for teachers in Portugal. And for those who are not Portuguese, we have to understand that CLIL and bilingual education is not very widespread in Portugal. So what are the main conclusions of the data we collected? So briefly, this is a table with the evolution of the national official CLIL bilingual program in schools from 2016 to 2022 that we analyzed, and it shows several things. The growth of CLIL implementation in Portugal has been relatively slow, despite the program expanding across different schools and different school cycles, I mean. It's important to note that CLIL is currently not integrated into upper secondary school in Portugal. Another significant observation is that the number of CLIL implementations has not seen significant increases across educational cycles, except perhaps for the transition between preschool and the first cycle. It's also noteworthy that the regional distribution of the PEBI program in Portugal is very uneven, with the northern region being overrepresented in comparison to the central and southern regions in Portugal. And for those interested in the development of the PEBI, there's a chapter in this volume by Ana Xavier and Julie Thijs from the DGE, Ministry of Education, and where they highlight several success criteria for the continuation of the official bilingual CLIL program in Portugal. And they mentioned ensuring information dissemination and securing stakeholder buy-in while fostering a whole school ethos, emphasizing the importance of an early start, maintaining continuity, revisiting curricular topic areas, which should be expanded upon and further developed each year, ensuring the presence of appropriate human resources, including strong leadership for the CLIL programs to support successful implementation, and prioritizing teacher training and providing adequate follow-up support to enhance CLIL practice. Now, this is the official program. When we come to the bottom-up initiatives, the growing presence of CLIL projects in Portuguese schools can be attributed solely to the dedicated efforts of numerous enthusiastic teachers who are committed to incorporating innovative teaching practices into their classes and the educational system as a whole. And these teachers take the initiative to design their own CLIL programs and materials, integrating them across various subjects in the curriculum. They often receive support from external stakeholders such as universities and polytechnics. That's where we come in. And what do? Well, we offer guidance and advice to teachers involved in CLIL initiatives, assisting them in developing effective approaches and strategies. We keep track of and document the progress and outcomes of school-based CLIL projects, helping to share best practice and experience. We contribute to the body of knowledge on CLIL through research publications, disseminating insights and findings that can inform and inspire CLIL practitioners. And we organize tailored courses and workshops specifically designed for school teachers, equipping them with the necessary skills and knowledge to implement CLIL successfully. So let me make a note that we only do this for the bottom-up initiatives. We are not involved with the official ministry program, which is catered for by the British Council. So it's very interesting to explore these bottom-up initiatives in terms of the reasons teachers give for why they do CLIL in schools. And they emphasize the following benefits for students: an early exposure to the target language, English, promoting future success and facilitating students' professional development, enhancing vocabulary production, increasing student motivation and enthusiasm for learning, and fostering the development of essential skills such as 21st century skills. They also mention the global status of English as playing a significant role, and they highlight the importance of more effective transdisciplinary learning. So in addition to these benefits, to what they see as benefits and motivations, the teachers who participated, who answered our questionnaires, also highlighted several challenges associated with CLIL implementation. And they include their own linguistic proficiency in the foreign language, the lack of didactic materials, the need for articulation and collaboration. They emphasize the importance of fostering better coordination and collaboration among different departments and educational levels to ensure cohesive CLIL implementation throughout the school. They mention lack of time for planning and material production. And they also mention lack of specific teacher development opportunities. So this brings us to the second focal point, which is the provision and nature of continual professional development for teachers. And we have identified the following support structures, some of them stronger than others. So on the one hand, there's scarce inclusion of explicit teaching about CLIL in master's degrees for teaching. There's very limited explicit teaching about CLIL in master's degrees in education. And this is something we should correct. The other thing we noticed is that Erasmus Plus funding has played a crucial role in supporting various regional and national teacher education initiatives. There are specific actions within this program that encourage collaboration between higher education institutions and schools, which may be very relevant and has been quite relevant for the provision of teacher education. And the other interesting thing is that the concept of CLIL in these projects intersects with many other educational concepts, such as digital learning, citizenship education, education for sustainability, and the pursuit of quality and efficiency in education. This convergence can create some tension and create some challenges around the concept of CLIL. CLIL is, I think, positioned as an umbrella, overarching umbrella term for collaborative, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, student-centered practice that sometimes is not really CLIL, but it doesn't really matter when we start experimenting with CLIL, in my point of view. So let me move on. So what are the key points? The findings of this exploratory study shed light on the current state of CLIL implementation in Portugal. And there are several key points that become very obvious. The small-scale official bilingual program promoted by the DGE British Council gains broader scope when grassroots initiatives are integrated and combined with it. The inclusion of local initiatives is crucial for advancing CLIL practice. In our opinion, centralized educational policy should prioritize expanding the number of students, teachers, and schools engaged in high-quality CLIL education. Addressing the geographical imbalance in the distribution of CLIL across Portuguese state schools should also be a priority. There is a need for further encouragement and support for teachers in schools to participate in CLIL-focused Erasmus Plus projects that cater to their specific contextual needs and offer training opportunities. The bottom-up approach to CLIL, as observed through Erasmus Plus funded actions, demonstrates its potential to support innovation, enhance technological competence development for both teachers and students, foster intercultural education, facilitate interdisciplinary integration, and promote greater collaboration among teachers. So efforts are being made by higher education institutions and also API, which is the Portuguese Association of Teachers for English, and other national and international bodies to supplement the national offering of training courses and workshops provided by the DGE British Council. And the example we heard about earlier is also part of this. So accredited in-service courses for teachers show promise in meeting the demand for CLIL professional development. There is room for further development in teacher education, requiring concerted action for all stakeholders involved in order to reach a wider public of in-service teachers in schools. Networked online training and small private open modular courses for teachers tailored to address the specific needs of teachers can be effective approaches to reach a wider audience of in-service teachers in schools. Let me just share with you something that we have developed last year, which is not a MOOC, but a SPOC. A SPOC is a small private online course for CLIL, on CLIL in higher education, that can be attended by anyone. It's designed specifically for higher education teachers who are interested in incorporating CLIL into their EMI, English Medium of Instruction practices. It's accessible through the link that you see there. It's a self-study format that allows participants to engage with the course content at their own pace. It's a 10-hour course of comprehensive material to equip higher education teachers with the necessary knowledge and skills to effectively implement CLIL in their teaching practices. And it is open and closed during the year according to the offers of several higher education institutions that develop the course. So I don't know how I am about time. How can anybody tell me if I'm okay with time?
Please feel free to
I can go on?
yes, please.
Shut me up when okay.
I have already a lot of questions.
Okay. So I wanted now to reach the final part of my presentation and share with you some recommendations gathered by contributors to this edited volume on context and conditions for successful CLIL in Portugal. And these recommendations really aim to stimulate reflection and provide insights from teachers to other teachers. And that's why I wanted to share them here with you. So one overarching recommendation for CLIL implementation is the use of translanguaging. So Feller strongly emphasizes the importance of maintaining fluidity and seamless transitions between English and or Portuguese for clarifying content and providing instructions in all CLIL contexts. She encourages teachers and policymakers and other practitioners in CLIL contexts to continually voice their translanguaging practices to make them valid. It's important to get rid of the fear that in the English or the bilingual class, well, it's not called the English class anymore, it's called the English class. We can use our full linguistic repertoires. Another strong recommendation is project-based learning and developing projects in CLIL. So Alves, one of our contributors, advocates for the implementation of the project-based learning approach in CLIL programs, regardless of age or language level of the students. It is seen by other researchers to deepen student understanding of curricular subjects, and it really is an opportunity to encourage active involvement not only of students but also of their parents and external stakeholders with school. A third recommendation in our volume concerns citizenship and intercultural education. Liao asserts that citizenship education holds significant importance for all learners due to its international dimension, and therefore it should be taught in English, through English, using the bilingual approach. So in this context, let me make a parenthesis here and call your attention to a project I was very directly involved in, which is the CLIL for Young European Citizens Erasmus Plus funded project, in which we combined not only citizenship education, but also project-based learning in connection to active construction of knowledge, situated learning, social interaction, cognitive development through the use of technological tools, hands-on learning, a learning-centered focus, and virtual exchange among the students. So this project is quite interesting in bringing all these things together and is available for everybody to use. So it focuses on fostering European citizenship, environmental preservation, and basic financial education as part of a concept of citizenship education, preparing students to become active citizens in their world. So I think here we moved a step forward from integrating the integration of language learning and curricular subject to cross-curricular and intercultural education for European citizenship, and the development of key competences and basic skills through CLIL. And I think this is quite interesting when you look at all the materials that were produced. So there's a guide addressed to teachers on how to use CLIL that also includes 15 ready-made lesson plans to adapt to your own classes. And there's a guide addressed to teachers on how to involve the pupils, families, and other stakeholders in CLIL activities in several modes. There's this narrative mode, but then there's also a game-based mode. And there's also an e-course for teachers to take and parents to take at their own leisure, where they can learn about everything that the project developed. So I'll just leave this with you as a comment, a side comment on this project, this research we have been conducted. So in terms of further recommendations that you can find in this volume, so I wanted to show that we also deal with the school levels. For preschool, some colleagues advise to create an educational environment where the presence of English is reflected in the child's daily life, to adopt a flexible and holistic pedagogy centered on play, and to develop cooperative work between preschool teachers and foreign language teachers as crucial for success. We have to understand that in the Portuguese context in preschool, the foreign language teacher is not part of the school, is someone who comes in. So this is quite interesting to read about. And in higher education, there are also colleagues who emphasize the importance of each higher education institution adopting a solid and comprehensive language policy that clearly defines the requirements for implementing CLIL. This level, B2 level, according to the Common European Framework Reference, is necessary for all teachers. And they also defend the establishment of a community of practice. And this is something where all teachers, language teachers, and all the other lecturers at the university can share expertise, can collaborate, can reflect on their pedagogical practice. And this is in line with the training guide we developed many years ago now, where and it's also available online, where we wanted people really, all the higher education teachers involved in CLIL to understand what is at stake if you want to adopt a CLIL approach. So really moving to the final conclusions. And my final conclusions are about professional development and developing professional educational opportunities for teachers. And so I'm getting tired. My voice is getting tired. So teachers at all levels of education require solid foundation in the theoretical principles of CLIL, as well as practical knowledge about the CLIL approach. This should be complemented with ongoing professional development opportunities in CLIL and a focus on fostering teacher collaboration and support communities. So CLIL training courses should not be limited to the field of language teacher education. Professional development for teachers should be extended to educators from all subject areas, recognizing the interdisciplinary nature of CLIL. Continuing professional development programs should emphasize both methodology and language development. Allison, which has a very interesting chapter on this in this book, recommends the inclusion of an optional subject focused on teaching through another language in master's degree programs in education. This optional module would cater to students studying for master's degrees in teaching non-language subjects, providing them with specific knowledge and skills relating to teaching subjects through English. So models on CLIL should be incorporated in the curriculum of English language teaching didactics in master degree programs, alongside other approaches, methods, and techniques in English language teaching, which currently it is not. And cross-curricular approaches to teaching foreign languages should be included in didactics for teaching English on master programs on teaching English to young learners, which currently is not there either. So there's a lot to do there. So also in-school teacher collaboration supported by coordinated timetabling and observation is crucial for successful CLIL implementation. So collaboration between content and language teachers is essential, and adopting a whole school approach to language across the curriculum is recommended. And what else? And this approach, in fact, should be applied to the teaching of every subject in the student's mother tongue, not only to what we call bilingual program. So by implementing these recommendations, educational institutions can enhance professional development, opportunities for teachers, and ensure the successful integration of CLIL in their curricula, we think. So what are the ways forward? So there's a lot of things to do yet. So looking ahead, we believe that the implementation of CLIL, being a dynamic educational phenomenon, requires ongoing scrutiny and research focused on outcomes. It is crucial to continue investigating and examining the impact of CLIL in educational contexts. And to this end, the Working CLIL Research Strand at SETAPS is actively planning the next stages of the mapping process. I've showed you the first stage. Now, hopefully, we'll have other stages to follow on. And these future endeavors aim to delve deeper into understanding how teachers actively engage with CLIL and bilingual education, with a particular emphasis on capturing their own perspectives and their own voices, so through detailed interviews. So with this, I will thank you for listening to me. And also invite you all to join us at the Working CLIL Research Strand and also at our forthcoming conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professora Margarida. It was a highly valuable contribution that you made today. Very interesting, lots of insights, lots of food for thought, I would say. Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone would like to ask some questions, make some comments. I give you the floor if anyone wants to participate. If not, I would like to ask some questions, if you don't mind, Professora Margarida?
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
And perhaps a few comments on what you've said. One of the first things that I wrote here in my notes was the shift from learning English to using English, which I find very interesting and very straight to the point. Anna and I, we've been trying to implement for some years now this perspective, I think. And most of the times nowadays, I find myself thinking that I'm not teaching English anymore. I'm rather teaching my students how to use English. And sometimes, because they're not used to this perspective, and I don't know if Anna agrees with me, we have recently launched a free course at the university which we called Professional English. And the objective of this course is not to teach English, rather to teach students how to use English language in their professional lives. But we found ourselves having to explain this to our students who enrolled in the course, because they're not used to this perspective. And I find it very interesting that you focused that shift from learning English to using English, because I think that we have still to go a long way before we have this fully implemented in our schools, I think, because the focus, I think, is still very much on teaching the language only. And I find it interesting. I have here some, I would say,
So if
questions.
I can make a comment on that,
Yeah, please.
I think that's what the point we were making is that to project-based learning, it is much more obvious that the students will use English to do the tasks they have to do in order to develop their project. So I think it's important that we understand how to implement, as teachers, we understand how to facilitate this process in the classroom. Because teachers, your students come from school, they have been learning English in Portugal for 12 years. They come with their own habits of learning the language, of reproducing the grammar. And obviously, many of them, not all, because there are different schools and different teachers, they are shy of speaking, although they should have been schooled in the communicative methods, but they are shy of speaking, and they only use English to reproduce the grammar they were taught. So if we create the conditions in learning in the English language classroom, I also teach business English, I teach ESB. If we create the conditions for them to use English efficiently and in real life, sort of authentic situations, they will have to. And then we see how they can become self-directed learners in their own use of English. That's why I'm a strong advocate of this project-based learning method and task-based learning method, where you use the language to do something, to communicate something effectively for several audiences. And that's what I think was lacking from, and is still lacking from some of our school programs in English, right?
Yes,
so I think we are getting there. When we launched this, for instance, this CLIL for Young European Citizen citizen project with several teachers in schools in Portugal, it's amazing what children at primary can do through project-based learning, using the language, using their linguistic repertoires to develop the project, basically. And that's quite interesting.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to know how surprised sometimes our students are because they're learning, they're still learning English, they just don't realize it. And it's their happy faces when they realize, oh, after all, I'm improving a lot without even realizing precisely because of that, because they have to use it like in reproducing real life situations and so on. I would like to ask you a question. I don't know if you have any explanation or any insights on why we have those regional differences between the north and the south of the country when it comes to implementing CLIL in our schools. Why is that? Is that because teachers in the north are more enthusiastic about it, or?
Well, I think there might, well, this is tentative, okay? There might be several factors. One is the demographic factor. Obviously, the north is much more populated than the south. But then the center, Lisbon, should come in also widely represented in CLIL, and does not. So that does not cater for it. But there are a lot of private schools in the north which are using the CLIL approach. And then, so there's also competition among, public and private schools with these programs. So this might be a reason. Also, we understand that in order to develop an official CLIL program, that's difficult. You need a stable teaching staff. You need stable teaching staff, and that's a problem in the south of Portugal. Probably Lisbon has a huge problem also with teachers. So, and in order to develop a CLIL program, you need this continuation among levels, and this is probably much more feasible in the north than it is in the Lisbon, where there's shortage of teachers, and namely English teachers. So they roll a lot, and obviously south of Portugal would have the same problem. So my reasons would rather be connected to demographic, cultural, socioeconomic factors, rather than other things. And also, we have to understand that we might think that bilingual education works best in big towns, which is the case in the north of Portugal. But in fact, I'm in Castelo Branco, and we have a very successful bilingual program in a small town, Fundão, close to Castelo Branco, very rural, and it's a hugely successful bilingual program. So I don't think the geography of it is just, it's really connected with teacher continuity, also probably the age of teachers, how they are, do they want to get involved in innovative approaches in education, and also the buy-in of parents. I know that here locally, the buying in parents into the bilingual program was hard, probably harder than in a big town like Porto or Lisbon would be.
Yeah.
So I would say tentatively, we don't have facts, we don't have data for this. This is what we want to follow through with our interviews, understand a little bit more why teachers are engaged with it. From my intuition tells me that a good CLIL leader in school is the fundamental.
Yes.
Someone who is not old enough to retire, but not young enough, that is inexperienced, but can carry out, has the knowledge of the school environment, and has the leadership to bring on board subject teachers, language teachers, work with them, train them, support them. It has been very crucial. And then there's obviously some town councils, like in the south of Portugal, there was a town council that had a very strong leadership in developing of a bilingual program at preschool level. And that was also interesting, but it hasn't been replicated anywhere else, which is
a shame.
Yeah. So maybe we need to disseminate it a little bit more. So every time I give a talk where there's a representative of the town council, I give this example for them to know that they have a role. They could have a role in the development of bilingual education in schools, especially pre and primary, which is the scope of the town councils.
Which leads me to my, I wouldn't say second, but fourth or fifth question, sorry. why the absence of the upper secondary school? Because I'm really surprised at this. Since we know that nowadays we have a number of universities offering programs, I think in business, economics, and so on, that are fully delivered in English, for example. So we would expect, and also with the internationalization of our universities, in which the teachers obviously have to be prepared to deal with all the international students, we would expect to have like a stronger presence of the upper secondary school involved in CLIL programs, which are really important for preparing students for the university and for their stays in foreign universities as well. So it puzzles me not to see upper secondary schools, probably because of the reasons that you have already mentioned related to teaching.
But I think there's an additional reason for that. And I failed to mention vocational. We have a very good example. We had a very, there was a master's thesis on the development of CLIL in a vocational school, which was quite interesting, but we didn't bring in those data here. But I think that in my guess is, because we haven't talked to teachers, my guess is the fear of the exams, the national exams, because upper secondary is totally dominated by the national exam at the end of the cycle, and therefore there's no time for experimentation there. Yeah. I think, and so parents would be, it has to be very clearly explained to parents what would be the advantages, and obviously the marks would probably not be that high, and we know there's a very high competition on marks for entry into universities, and I think that's the reason why, because we don't have a policy that values learning science through English. Like when I visited many Italian schools where they started the CLIL program before they covered it, before it became compulsory in primary, their experimentation was at upper secondary, vocational and non-vocational schools, and it was great. But obviously then the students wanted to enroll abroad. They wanted.
I promise this is the last question for you.
Yeah.
So when you talk about training development opportunities for teachers, who are these teachers? Are we talking about language teachers only, or language and content teachers alike?
Well, I talked about pre-service teachers that we need to look into their master's content. Mm-hmm. I talked about in-service, there's those that are already teachers in schools, school teachers, that also need professional development opportunities in CLIL. And when I speak, school teachers are not only language teachers, as I mentioned, but also all the other teachers that would like to use, to be part of the bilingual program. And when we did some training here at Fundão, we involved both geography teachers, primary teachers, because primary teachers, you need to understand that in Portugal, primary teachers have, those students who are learning to become primary teachers have no single curricular unit in a foreign language. They have no methodology on learning in a bilingual environment. They have no idea on how to teach a linguistically diverse classroom. There's nothing in and this is DGE imposed curricula for teacher education, because they are the employers of these teachers. And so that's a problem. And then higher education, we also talk about higher education teachers who are teaching in English or claim to be teaching in English or in any other language. They're Erasmus students or they're full classes, but they have no idea how to adopt, how to teach in a foreign language and what the foreign language dictates in terms of the needs of the students and their own needs and their own way of explaining things, right? So they also need a little bit of, that's why we developed that small private open online course for higher education teachers. So if they are using English to teach, at least let's understand a little bit of what we are doing. Because we as language teachers, we know we've been schooled into teaching a foreign language and bilingual education methods and so on. But most of the people they just think I just use it and translate my PowerPoint. So they also need some support there, and they realize they need some support because they come up to us and say, well, I teach this in English, but they don't seem to understand, obviously, because there are several reasons involved in this, isn't it? So these are all the teachers, I think, we need professional development opportunities for. And also, obviously, English teachers, right? Who need to understand that the way they teach English and the way their students are learning English and the purposes for which they are learning English are quite different from what they used to be.
Yes. Yes, of course. Yes, thank you, Professora Margarida.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. So I don't know if anyone else wants to say something. I can see that we have already our next speaker, Professor Tom Morton. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. So if you
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. If you all agree, I think we could have like a break now, 10 minutes. Is that okay with you? Do you agree? Yes, so we would be back at 11:40. Yes, thank you very much. See you in a while. Thank you.
Thank you. See you in 10 minutes then.
Thank you.
Welcome back on the second part of this online conference. I'm very pleased to present you Professor Tom Morton. He's a lecturer and researcher at University of Autónoma de Madrid. When he's ready, we can start the second part of the meeting. Welcome back, Professor. I'm just going to do a quick presentation. Professor Tom Morton is Beatriz Galindo Distinguished Researcher Fellow in the Department of English Studies, Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, Spain. He's a member of the University Autónoma de Madrid research group, which carries out research on content and language integration in bilingual education. He is also interested in teacher knowledge and identity and the professional development of university lectures in English medium instruction. Therefore, he will be presenting conference with the theme of using cognitive discourses functions to integrate content and language in classrooms, teaching and assessment. Welcome, Professor Tom. Very nice to have you here.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Okay, shall I share my screen now?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Put it on slideshow. Okay. Can you see the presentation, everyone?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation to attend this event and to get the opportunity to learn about bilingual education and CLIL scene in Portugal. The previous speaker's talk, Professor Morgado or Margarida, if I may, allowed me to get a lot of insight into in a very wide-ranging way of the situation in bilingual education and CLIL in Portugal. I recognize most of the issues, perhaps all of the issues, that came up in the talk, and I hope that some of these issues may come up again in my contribution, perhaps through a different kind of lens, the lens of cognitive discourse functions and the work that my colleagues and I have been carrying out at the Autónoma University in Madrid in the Spanish context, but also with other European partners. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? Well, we're given with a kind of a problem, separation of content and language in teaching and assessment in bilingual education and CLIL. The idea that we can have content teaching, content, and we can have language, and they kind of can be physically together. But language may be, and this came up in Margarita's talk, that language can be looked at in a certain way in terms of grammar, vocabulary, in a traditional way. So it's kind of just there, but not really integrated with the content. So how do we, what can help us to get towards greater integration of content and language? Okay, so when we have a problem, we can have a solution. So a possible solution, or at least a partial solution, is to look at something called cognitive discourse functions. And I will, of course, explain where these come from and what they are. There are 7 families of cognitive discourse functions, so obviously it wouldn't be possible to look at all of them in a single talk. So I'm going to use one function, the function of definitions, as an example to show how this approach can shed some light on content and language integration. And then I will briefly describe some of the work that we've been carrying out recently in our research group using something called comparative judgment. And I'll explain what comparative judgment is for any members of the audience who may not be familiar with it. And I'll end up with some implications for teaching and assessment if we do try to incorporate cognitive discourse functions into our approach to integrating content and language. So questions that we might want to find an answer to: how can we link content learning objectives, science, specific science objectives, history objectives, geography objectives, art, crafts, physical education, any subject, to appropriate language objectives, which go beyond highlighting that, for example, we use the present continuous in this activity, for example, or we use the past tense, things like that. In terms of assessment, how can we avoid random correction of surface errors? For example, teachers get back some work from students and they perhaps use red ink to correct, highlight spelling mistakes, mechanical mistakes of mechanics, some grammar mistakes. But the language features which are being given attention are not necessarily connected to the content learning objectives. And how can we support students in developing disciplinary literacy in subjects taught through English? Excuse me, I have a slight cold or hay fever. I've been sneezing a lot this morning, so forgive me if I suddenly sneeze very loudly in the middle of this presentation. But at the moment, there's quite a lot of work going on. For example, you'll be aware, some of you will be aware of the current COST project, which looks at disciplinary literacy in subjects taught through English. So we're bringing in the concept of not just learning how to communicate in English or learning English through or using English. You know, this distinction is very important, the learning and using distinction, through studying academic subjects, but also how to develop the capacity to communicate, read, write, for example, or use other multimodal or digital media in ways which are appropriate to the disciplinary content, okay? So the ways of communicating in science, the ways of communicating in history. So this has become quite a strong focus in recent work on CLIL, the idea of disciplinary literacy. And CDFs, cognitive discourse functions, I will argue, can play a role in contributing to this. Okay, so I've already mentioned cognitive discourse functions a few times, so it's time to briefly explain what they are. We all know that in school subjects, there are typical things that teachers want students to do, learning outcomes, which and they're often expressed through different verbs. Verbs like describe, define, explain, give an opinion, compare. So teachers in any subject can understand this, that they want their students to carry out some kind of operation in relation to expressing knowledge. And there's been quite a lot of work, for example, in the European context by people like Vollmer, Biacco, to kind of put together the kind of the typical and most commonly used learning objectives across subjects. And this is an interesting thing for teachers to think about. Often teachers will say to students, or even in textbooks, we will find tasks which say, explain, blah, 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 describe something or other. And often when you look at the task itself, it's not actually asking them to explain anything. It may be asking them to describe, maybe asking them to do something else. So even at this level, it's quite useful for teachers, for all of us as teachers, to think about what exactly we want the students to do when we give them some kind of learning task. And these learning objectives can appear across all subjects in the curriculum. So we can then think about, okay, we want students to produce definitions, descriptions, reports, comparisons. So what does a good one need to have? What would be the components, for example, of a good definition or a good description? And moving a bit further along, what about the typical language patterns that are used to express these functions? The types of verbs, the tenses that are used, perhaps relative clauses, etc. So we can say that yes, by using cognitive discourse functions, we can incorporate grammar, and often the typical grammar that language teachers are aware of, and which is part of their structural syllabi that they use, but it would be done in the context of learning objectives. So how specific lexicogrammatical features are used to express typical academic functions. So in a way, with cognitive discourse functions, this is a way that allows us to be perhaps more concrete when we're talking about academic language. The work that I've been doing with the UAM CLIL research group with colleagues like Ana Llanares over the last 10, 15 years has been basically a move towards seeing CLIL as a way of developing students' academic language competences. So it's been a move kind of away from seeing CLIL as a context for the development of general language competence towards what are the specific language competences which are required to express and acquire disciplinary knowledge. And cognitive discourse functions were originated as a term by a colleague we work with quite a lot, Christiane Dalton-Puffer of the University of Vienna. And Christiane, when she came up with the construct cognitive discourse functions, was concerned to kind of, I would say, to kind of tidy up the kind of mess there is around, because there are so many of these terms which are floating around, which teachers use, which are in official documents, which are in curricular documents, and they come from different sources. You can go back to Bloom's taxonomy. And more updated versions of this taxonomy. And she, her aim really was to bring this together in a way that was more coherent and more useful as a way of communicating with teachers about these typical learning objectives and how they may be represented in language. So she, in her construct, she sees cognitive discourse functions as being organized in 7 types or families. And these, she puts this into language, which is kind of quite simple to communicate with practitioners, and people who are not familiar with the terms. So these are like basic operations which can happen across different educational contexts. So we might want our learners to cut up the world according to certain ideas. We might want them to tell us about the extension of this object of specialist knowledge. And we get these 7 families. Within these 7 families, they can also be broken up into more specific examples within them. But this is basically the way of organizing the 7 cognitive discourse functions. So this is a language that, these are terms that potentially can be taken to teachers. And not only, an important thing here is not only language teachers, or not even especially language teachers, but teachers of other content, because they will recognize that these kinds of objectives are used in teaching their own subjects. Another way of conceptualizing cognitive discourse functions is to see them kind of as in the middle between 2 things. So we can see, like, often we will ask students to work with whole texts, so different text types. In the terminology, we can refer to genres as whole text types as being genres: report, narrative, explanation, etc. Then we can think about the lexicogrammatical level: nominalizations, verbal relations, tense, mood, etc. So we have, in teaching subjects, we have texts, of course, which is kind of the bigger level, and we have specific language features. CDFs can kind of fit in the middle here, okay? So they can also be seen as key uses of academic language. These operations that we've just mentioned: classify, define, describe, evaluate, etc. So they kind of occupy this space in the middle. Another way of looking at them is to see them in terms of overlapping areas of content, language, and literacy. So, of course, when we, as most people who are researchers or thinkers in the area of CLIL, people like Bill Coyle, for example, would say, no, we start with the content. We start thinking about the content. What is the content knowledge we want students to learn? Then we have ways of bringing together content and language. And then this other dimension of literacy, which is the appropriate ways of communicating in the subject. So we have many ways of thinking about content and language together. Perhaps one of the best known is Coyle's, or Coyle et al.'s, language of learning, language for and through learning. So we can think about, okay, we have some content, some science, history, etc., and we can think about the language that is needed for students to learn this content, or language they need to use in learning the content. When we think about literacy, then we can think about what are the specific types of communication which are typical of this subject. For example, in science education, students may need to work with lab reports, laboratory reports. With history, they may have to do some kind of biographical recount, the life of an influential person in history. So we're thinking about the different ways of speaking and writing which conform to the conventions of the different disciplines. And of course, when we look at literacy and language, we have different kinds of genres which can appear in different ways across the curriculum: narratives, descriptions, arguments, etc. So we have these 3 kind of overlapping dimensions, and perhaps cognitive discourse functions as being something more, let's say, more concrete and precise, can kind of perhaps fit in the middle here at this kind of section where we have an overlap between these things. So they can help us to think about content, because they are cognitive in the sense that they are related to certain types of thinking skills. Okay, they are to do with language, obviously, because definitions, explanations, reports all have linguistic components and features, and they are building blocks in terms of constructing the typical genres which are used in many different academic subjects. Okay, so I hope I've given you a kind of an overview of cognitive discourse functions, where they come from, in terms of different taxonomies of learning objectives, which have been developed over time, who they come from, basically the work of Christiane Dalton-Puffer, and what they kind of consist of. Okay, so to look at an example, definitions. Definitions are a fairly simple cognitive discourse function. Others, we've been doing work for the last 10 years, I think, on different cognitive discourse functions: explore, classify, evaluate, and they can be quite complex in terms of their components, but definitions are probably a good place to start, because you can see quite clearly what are the components of definitions, and perhaps some of the linguistic features that students need to master if they want to use them. And definitions as an aspect of academic language, well, for content teachers, we might want to ask them, why would I want my students to define something? What is the role of definition in my subject, or teaching a specific topic, for example? So I think it's a good idea to always think about, from the point of view of content learning, what's the reason for doing this? Why do I want my students to do definitions? And if I want my students to produce a definition of something, what would be a good definition? And do the students know what I expect from them in terms of what is a good definition? What does a definition have? And what language is typical of definitions? So here's a possible kind of way in to thinking about definitions with teachers. If teachers ask, why should we have definitions, were a couple of possible answers. They can allow students to produce authentic scientific statements in an appropriate grammatical form. So a way of expressing, for example, scientific knowledge appropriately. And they can help students to gradually gain control of grammatical features of scientific English, which is an aspect of disciplinary literacy. And teachers in any subject will most likely come up with other reasons why they want their students to define something. Teachers are often quite concerned that students are using terminology in the subject appropriately. So asking students for definitions of terms can also be a good way of checking the students' knowledge of things. There's been quite a lot of work on definitions, and there's too much of it to refer to in one slide, but a lot of the work comes from the ESP tradition on academic writing, academic definitions. And they can be seen to have three components. So we have the thing that's to be defined. So we want you to define ecosystem, okay? The class or object or concept to which the term belongs. So something belongs to a bigger class. So an X is a Y, a cat is a mammal, for example. And then we have differentiating characteristics that can distinguish it from other members of its class. So it's relatively easy to answer the question, what does a definition consist of? And definitions can be produced by speakers, writers, students in our case, without, basically the most common way I think is without the class. So a student may write something like this, or say it perhaps in a different way. An ecosystem is the combination of the habitat. In the ESP literature, a complete definition with all three components is a formal definition, and definitions which lack one or more of the components are semi-formal, okay? So we can have, as a teacher then, we could start to think about, what am I happy for my students to produce? Do they have to produce formal definitions, or am I okay with semi-formal definitions? Perhaps missing the class. Is it still enough evidence for me that my students understand this concept? So these are not decisions that we can make for teachers, but it's useful for having a dialogue about what the expectations may be. And a couple more examples of, there's a tendency sometimes for students to produce a kind of comparison rather than a formal definition. So an ecosystem is like something, okay? It's like a food chain, and some teachers may be unwilling to accept this. They're saying this is not a definition, you know, it's saying something is like something else. It's not saying that it's a member of a certain class which has certain differentiating characteristics. So we can look then at the language of definitions, concrete and abstract nouns. Quite a lot of abstract nouns, especially to think about the classes that things can belong to. The rather simple, and Christiane Dalton-Puffer in her 2007 book mentions that she's quite surprised that teachers don't pay more attention to definitions because she says grammatically, after all, they're quite simple, you know? So there shouldn't be that much difficulty with definitions. So it's something that teachers could possibly draw attention to more often than they do. So we can look at different linguistic components, possible use of relative clauses. And I suppose when students provide more distinguishing characteristics of things, it opens up the language a bit more. There are more possibilities for things they can include to distinguish the thing they are defining, to distinguish its features. There's been quite a lot of work on definitions. In a recent special issue of the Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, my colleague Anna and my colleague Nashwa Nashad Sove have published a paper on students' definitions. I'm going to show you a few examples of students' definitions from different projects. At the moment, we are involved in a project with the British Council in Spain. The British Council began a bilingual education project in Spain in collaboration with the Spanish Ministry of Education in 1996. And at the moment, there are over 50 secondary schools in this project. And we are working with the British Council in looking at assessment practices in not all of the schools, because it would be too much. We are using a sample of about 20 of the schools. And we are asking the students to produce, we give them prompts which will elicit different cognitive discourse functions together in texts. And then we as the team are analyzing the results in terms of cognitive discourse functions, and also asking teachers in the schools to evaluate the students' texts through something called comparative judgment, which I will briefly explain. So just a quick look at some definitions that very recently some students have done in British Council schools, secondary schools. One issue we've had, of course, in judging the students' texts is handwriting, as you can see. So we've had to transcribe all their work into text files so that we can evaluate them and judge them, okay? And you can see quite a range of production in terms of students producing definitions. Here they are defining cells, okay? And these examples also raise issues for teachers. So you're looking at a student's example of an example of students' work. So what would a language teacher say about this? What would a content teacher say about this? Which criteria would they use to evaluate this work? So what we've been doing is we're getting teachers to evaluate students' work in a way that's very, very instinctive and very holistic. And then afterwards to talk about the criteria that they used. And we've been working not only with the bigger project in the British Council, but we do this in small groups in professional development and in schools around the Madrid area. And we have small teams of content teachers paired up with language teachers. And they look at examples of students' work and then together discuss criteria for assessing them. So what kind of language criteria, what kind of content criteria. Through this kind of collaboration, we're trying to kind of bring together content and language teachers in thinking about what are the elements of successful student production in language terms and in academic terms. And we think cognitive discourse functions are a useful vehicle for this kind of collaboration. So what is comparative judgment? We use a very well-known organization in the UK, which has this very appealing title, No More Marking. So if you say this to any teacher, like, no more marking, you know, wow, is this the end of marking? You know, this is like, you know, paradise for teachers. It doesn't quite promise the end of marking, but it does say something quite thought-provoking, that it's based on the idea that human beings as evaluators are much better at comparing two things than we are at just taking one thing and saying how good, bad, or middling it is. And the claim is based on quite strong statistical evidence, goes back almost a century to work in statistics, that claims that if you ask people to look at two things and say which one is the better, without thinking about it very much, just quickly reading it, looking at this one's better. And you get enough people to do it, enough times, with enough text, enough examples, statistically, you get more reliable evaluation than you get with, for example, rubrics, you know, or checklists, yeah, or individual markers trying to mark against a set of criteria. Okay, so that is the claim. And this organization, No More Marking, produces provides a service in the UK to thousands of schools, to the Ministry of Education, to do benchmarking and marking projects on a very wide scale. And this is used for, we need to be careful about what it's used for. It's used for the kind of judging that's normally quite difficult for teachers to do. In other words, for open tasks. So when, say, primary school writing or secondary school writing, when teachers have to judge a piece of writing, okay, and often, you know, we think that this leads to subjectivity, no, too much subjectivity. So what am I going to say about this piece of writing? You know, so it's kind of an open task. What do I pick to say about this? So obviously, we wouldn't need comparative judgment to mark the results of multiple choice tests, yeah, because it marks itself basically. But when we have these kind of open-ended tasks, comparative judgment can be one way to improve reliability in evaluation. Okay, so comparative judgment, red apples, green apples, quickly choose between one and the other. So what we've got, at the moment, we have 100 teachers in the British Council schools judging quite quickly hundreds of texts, okay? So this is what the kind of thing that the teachers see on the screen. So they see two texts and they have to read them and click left or right, which one they think is the best. So teachers do that, and we don't want to overload them. They may have a 20-minute or session of doing this, in which they may look at 15 or 20 pairs of texts. Yep. We don't want to tire them out with doing this. So the more teachers we have doing it, the greater reliability, and the more quickly we can deal with quite a lot of texts. And the results, in terms of the rankings of the texts, are statistically reliable. In fact, the program allows you to kind of, if we find that one teacher is kind of evaluating the text in a very, very different way from all the others, a kind of misfit, we can eliminate that teacher's judgments from the whole exercise. So we did this on a much smaller scale with a professional development for course for teachers a couple of years ago. And we asked them just to, not the whole text, just to look at specific cognitive discourse functions. We looked at explore, we looked at evaluate, and we looked at define. And we asked them, so we don't really have time here. If this was more like a workshop type of session, I would ask you to rank these, okay? And say, which one do you think is best? Which one's second? Which one's third, fourth? Yeah. And we might have some kind of, you know, interesting discussion about what are the content criteria? What are the language criteria? Here are the rankings, okay? So we can see that small groups of teachers, content and language teachers together, ranked those examples in that way. So even if you have a quick look, you might just see immediately what things seem to be typical of the samples at the bottom and what things are, are there in the samples at the top. The interesting thing here is that comparative judgment is holistic. It's quite intuitive. It's kind of based on the teacher's experience and knowledge. But once you've done the comparative judgment, then we can have, and we weren't using comparative judgment in this seminar in order to help the schools assess their students' work. We were using it as a professional development activity to stimulate reflection and collaboration between content and language teachers. So from that, and we actually recorded the conversations. So we've published, Anna, Inaris, and myself have published a couple of papers which look at how these discussions develop, in terms of the input that content teachers bring to it and the input that language teachers bring to it, and what they see. And we found some quite interesting things, that content teachers comment quite a lot on language, and language teachers can comment quite a lot on content. So it's not, when they get together and talk about examples of students' work, it doesn't necessarily fall into the content teachers only talking about how accurate this information is in terms of, for example, what is an ecosystem, or language teachers only talking about, I don't know, spelling mistakes or things like that. Okay, so this is we've been using this as a way of stimulating collaboration and reflection among content and language teachers, and also in the most recent professional development activity, we have asked teachers to develop activities in which they integrate cognitive discourse functions into sequences of activities in lessons. So some points for, I need about, am I okay for time? I think 5 minutes more, possibly, yeah?
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay, yeah. So probably not even 5 minutes, okay. So some points for reflection, which came up. Okay, so we didn't ask teachers, we didn't introduce the concept of cognitive discourse function before they did the judgment, okay? We wanted to see what their existing criteria were. Later in the seminar, we did introduce cognitive discourse function as a concept, excuse me. And we did have then some discussions about students' work in which we shared with the teachers as researchers our own analyses of these students' examples. And we talked about them through the lens of cognitive discourse functions. Content and language teachers may use different criteria, but they do overlap sometimes. Sometimes they, we had interesting conversations about that, because we showed the teachers tasks which we had developed. So some teachers said, I remember, for example, an art teacher saying, well, we don't actually assess art knowledge in this way. She was a little bit skeptical at the beginning, but actually, by the end of the seminar, she was one of the strongest advocates of cognitive discourse functions. But I mean, it also, if you're involved in professional development of teachers, we all know that we have to get buy-in from the teachers. We have to win them over, sometimes to different ways of thinking about things sometimes. We found in general that, and we do find this quite a lot, that very often, if we don't have this idea of cognitive discourse function, the language points that can be highlighted are not linked to the function so much. So teachers can highlight language points, tense mistakes, spelling mistakes, which would be there in any text. Okay, you could mark those mistakes and try to correct the students, and it wouldn't have anything to do necessarily with the aims of the content activity. So I mean, what we're trying to do is to move, to help them to reflect and move towards a more integrated way. Because you may not want to, I mean, as language teachers, as an English teacher, as a language teacher, I know that it's not advisable to correct everything that students produce. Yeah, in other words, to cover their text with red ink, for example. We need to be selective. Well, in terms of texts which have been written with a content learning objective, we can be very selective in the sense that we can focus on things which, and from the point of view of good teaching, these should be things that have already been shared with the students, which I'll highlight this again in a moment. So if we have this kind of, we all know that professional development is not a one-off, one-hit procedure. Go in with a workshop and disappear. It needs to be followed up. So we find out over time that discussions change and that teachers become more able to integrate the feedback they give on language to the content learning objectives. So some ideas, some implications, ideas for integrating CDFs, in this case, definitions in teaching a topic. So we can, we know that it's good practice to use exemplars, you know, for formative assessment with students, that students can look at examples of work done by other students, preferably not students in their own class. We don't want them to know the student who did the work, and talk about this work. You know, what is good about it? What's missing from this work? What does it need? So this could be done with definitions. Students could be helped to recognize whether the definition has all the components or whether something's missing and whether it matters for the definition. So students can begin to develop their own criteria for what makes a good example of this thing that they have to produce themselves. And they can perhaps do some kind of ranking themselves. We have also worked with getting students, secondary school students, to do comparative judgment. It's quite easy for them to do it. And there's some literature on it, on using comparative judgment as a way of stimulating and fostering peer assessment. So, so it's quite interesting when students are asked to do it. And we've done some work on that, comparing the students' judgments with teachers' judgments. And you get some quite interesting results, where the students can be sometimes much harder on a text than the teachers would be. Yeah, and to discuss why with students and teachers can be quite an eye-opening experience. Okay, so a way of fostering peer evaluation, peer feedback, and definitions. Okay, we don't necessarily want to look at definitions on their own. Definitions can appear. For example, if you have a description of something, it quite often begins with a definition of the thing that we're going to describe. In assessment, overall, it can help us to ensure that language assessment is linked to content learning objectives. So we've had this problem, which is always, and I've been working in CLIL for about 15 years, and right from the beginning all the way through, teachers worried about assessment. What do we pick, you know, in order to, where do we focus our assessment? Okay, what is content and language assessment? CDFs can be useful for that. They can be included explicitly in checklists and rubrics. You know, if you want students to produce a definition or classification, it can be levels of performance can be identified. For example, a top mark contains all the components. Next mark down, one component missing. Yeah, and we can also identify language features which are typical of the cognitive discourse function. And good practice, sharing rubrics and checklists with students, and perhaps, as I said before, getting them to use them with exemplars. It means that feedback in formative assessment can be more focused. We can say to students, it would be, you should work on this. Yeah, yeah. You tend, when you write definitions, you tend to miss the class, for example, if that is an issue with the student. So we can give students more precise information about where they need to focus their efforts in improving. And of course, they can be included in assessment of longer texts genres. Okay, to conclude, CDFs are building blocks for content knowledge, literacy, and language, the kind of Venn diagram that I showed earlier. They can be seen as being central to these things. They can be They are not necessarily seen on their own in isolation, although there is some overlap between the concept of genre and some, if CDFs get a bit long, they can turn into a whole text. You know, for example, explanation would be one example of that. They can help to overcome the problem I identified at the beginning, separation of content and language. And I think they have potential because sometimes we get content teachers who are unwilling to take on language teaching duties. They see themselves as teachers of content. There's an interesting paper by a couple of colleagues in Spain, David Bloch, and the other writer is Moncada. And they talk about CLILization of, they're talking about university level English medium instruction and about how lecturers, teachers are kind of resistant to being CLILized. Yeah, that they don't see themselves as being language teachers and they don't see EMI in their context as being like CLIL, okay, was there. So how do we convince content teachers that what we're doing with language is useful for their content learning objectives? And can we find ways of them integrating language into their practices without language being seen as an add-on, an extra burden, something else they have to do in an already crowded curriculum? So, and that's kind of that's part of the overall issue of helping all teachers to become more aware of the importance of disciplinary literacy in teaching their subjects, whether the language is in L1, L2, L3. And cognitive discourse functions, because they do, at least in the cognitive aspect, speak the language of content teachers. What do you want your students to do with this topic? They can be perhaps a good place to start to work with content teachers in helping them to be more aware of the importance of language and literacy in their teaching. And they can help teachers to improve their practices by sharing assessment criteria, by being more, in a way, this is what perhaps Bernstein would have called a more visible pedagogy, in that we are more explicit about what we want. Because sometimes in CLIL, I get the impression that in the content side, the science, history, they have a very clear idea of what the criteria are for learning, what Bernstein would call a visible pedagogy. But the language side is like, it just kind of happens by itself because they are involved in communicating in English in these subjects. They will just, by osmosis, kind of pick up the language, which does happen. And I am fully aware that, as second language acquisition researchers say, implicit learning is where it's at. But we have to bear in mind the fact that students are also developing a disciplinary literacy, and they need to have the tools for successful academic communication. So that's where CDFs can possibly fit in. And I think I'm going to stop there, a couple of references. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Tom. It was very, once again, like Professor Margarita's presentation, okay. Very interesting and very valuable. I don't know if anyone wants to make any comments or ask any questions. Please feel free to speak. No? Well, I would like to share some thoughts with you and with all of you. I was listening to you, Professor Tom, and I was thinking about some research that I've done for my PhD program in terminology and translation. And it has all to do with terms and definitions. And I was, well, I never thought really that we could teach language through definitions. and I think the perspective that you brought us here today is really interesting, because I came across with a PhD thesis with like 900 pages about definition, which was something incredible. So definitely it has a lot of things in its definition, and I find it very interesting that we can in fact use it as a tool to teach language. Now, on a more personal level, I was listening to you saying that perhaps we shouldn't mark the language errors or mistakes, if I'm not mistaken. At a certain point you mentioned that, or perhaps I misunderstood you.
Yeah, no, I don't think I quite said that we shouldn't mark language mistakes, no. But anyway,
So much,
carry on.
so much, probably it was so much. And I was thinking that I have a son, he's in the 8th grade, and most of his teachers, content teachers, they mark and they penalize the marks, the final grades of the tests and the exercises that they do when it comes to spelling mistakes, for example. And
in Portuguese?
Yes, for example, in history, in geography, sciences, whatever subject, they're writing in Portuguese, but they get like penalized for spelling mistakes, for example. And the other day he had a physics test, and he answered the question. I don't remember anymore exactly what was the precise question, but he didn't get the full marks because the teacher said that he used the concept disintegrate, and he shouldn't have, because he's not supposed to know what disintegrate is. And I was like, what am I going to do with this? Because I was very, I don't know, I wouldn't say shocked, but at least I was very surprised with the argument for this. So on the one hand, we're like penalizing students because they're making spelling mistakes, okay? On the other hand, we're penalizing students because they're using words that they're not supposed to know. So here we have like this term.
Can I comment on both of those things?
Yes, of course, please do. Thank you.
Maybe start with the second one first. It seems kind of, I agree, very surprising to punish a student for knowing something above the level. Yeah, that should normally be a cause for celebration. Yeah, rather than,
yes, of course.
Rather than in any case, it would be different if the teacher had said that he had used the word disintegrate instead of another word which is more appropriate for the content. That would be different, and that would be content teaching basically, rather than English teaching. The first, I know here that where I work in Spain, that teachers do punish students for mistakes in Spanish, so you can lose marks for that, but they're more lenient when it comes to bilingual English, and perhaps they are right in the sense that in English language or in second language acquisition, what is known about the effects of correction is quite confusing. There are all kinds of studies on correcting students' texts and the effect it can have on acquisition. So and normally language teachers, I'm not even talking about bilingual teachers, language teachers are not necessarily experts in that, on knowing what, because knowing what to correct has also got to do with the distinction between errors and mistakes, interlanguage development levels, what students can be expected to know. So it's very tricky, and we could get into kind of just correcting everything that we see is wrong without taking into account the students' developmental stage where they're at. So having, at least in the content subjects, having a more justified and justifiable approach to what we focus on in terms of language, and including here typical language structures as well, you know, tenses, modality, passives, these kind of things. We can perhaps work on those more from a functional level. So for example, why is the passive, why do we use it? You know, I even use the passive. Why is the passive used here? Yeah. So trying to understand or different modal verbs. For example, getting students to think of these things in terms of their meaning functions, which also, apart from CLIL, provides a very good service for communicative language teaching in general, you know, thinking about the meaning of language in use. So yeah, it's not a question of not giving feedback to students on their errors, but perhaps making feedback much more focused and much more appropriate to the, and also more related to what we actually explicitly teach them. Yeah. Okay, so that's probably my.
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
see a hand up.
Yes, Professora Margarida, Professor Margarida.
Yes, I had a question. I enjoyed your talk very much, and I understand how important it is for teachers to be taught how to come together and negotiate their learning outcomes through the cognitive discourse functions. But maybe you could explain this to me, which is from a macro perspective. If we focus on literacy, on disciplinary literacies, I think we are reinforcing something that is not good in our schools, that we see, which is that we see all the subjects separate from one another and very specifically different from one another. When on the other hand, we have been advocating for cross-disciplinary literacies.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have been advocating for how some text types, obviously we know this from experience, can be recycled from one discipline to another. Obviously, all these disciplinary literacies are being learned not only in English, but across the whole school curriculum. So I'm always afraid when I see this focus that you've just presented us, and you're quite entitled to it, and it's fine with me, and I also use it to explain some things. I'm really worried about whether we are not further compartmentalizing education into niches of, in physics you do it like this, in mathematics you do it like that, when in fact, when you have a problem to solve in higher education, we will need your mathematical knowledge, your physical knowledge, your physics knowledge, your language knowledge for effect, for example, rhetoric effect, which will not come up in the science degrees. So maybe you're the person to explain this to me, because this has been bothering me. So it's not a criticism, it's really a genuine interest in understanding how we can productively use it without going against some of the things, for instance, I believe in.
No, thank you for the question. It also bothers me, and I think about it a lot. And I'm very aware of people who are bothered in exactly the opposite direction that you are bothered in. There's for example, the idea of STEAM, you know, STEAM, STEM, and across the working across the curriculum in this is being heavily criticized at the moment. You know, I'm kind of and I'm not kind of decided one way or the other, because I'm reading a lot of stuff, especially from the UK, which is, in the UK, you may be aware, there's a very big turn back to a knowledge-based curriculum and a disciplinary knowledge-based curriculum, and it's very critical of things like project-based learning, problem-based learning, and they're using basically the work of John Sweller, you know, cognitive load theory, and it's getting into the policies now as well in the UK, you know, to this, and Hirsch's work on knowledge, on seeing knowledge as disciplinary, and a move away from this across the curriculum approach, a move away from this competences approach. And I find it really interesting because I work in Spain, but my background is the UK. Spain is going in totally the opposite direction. There's been a new law which basically implements a competence-based approach in Spanish secondary school education. and many teachers and teacher trainers and leaders are very, they're really excited by this, and this is for them the way to go. And here am I kind of following lots of, discussions in the UK context, Australian context as well, because I come from, my work with Anna comes from systemic functional linguistics background, Australian genre approach, and it is very focused on disciplinary knowledge. And so I'm also bothered by these things, but kind of in the middle between them. And my work is kind of leaning towards the opposite direction. It's more leaning towards disciplinary knowledge, knowledge-based curriculum, and more away from this across the curriculum approach. But I work in a master's program in secondary education with secondary English teachers, and they have a general module, of course, before they come to me to do the English part of their master's for teaching. And the philosophy of education that they receive is very much the kind of things that you've been talking about. So I have my own doubts about it, but I don't get involved in controversies about those things. I myself am lean more towards a disciplinary approach to knowledge and less towards an across the curriculum approach. But that's kind of where I am at the moment. If you'd spoken to me 15, 20 years ago, I would have been completely somewhere else. And that may change again, depending on the arguments.
And would you make a distinction in levels, school levels? Or would you?
Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert, of course, in preschool or primary. I've never worked. I mean, I've worked in secondary and university, obviously. But it seems to me to be fairly clear that in primary, at least in the early primary, the kind of idea of subjects is not such an important thing. The idea of subjects seems to appear at the end of primary. As they get towards the end of primary, they start to become separate. They start to have the idea of subject areas, and of course, they go to secondary school. Physically, they are separated in different classrooms, in different subject areas. So yeah, it has to do with the level, and perhaps as a rule of thumb, that the higher you go, the more disciplinary specific things. I mean, there are genres which are used in different subjects, narrative genre, but they are. I found this from being involved in EAP when I was working in the UK, English for academic purposes, for students, overseas international students starting degrees. And often we did EAP courses for them, how to write an essay, reading, academic communication. And lecturers would often complain that those courses didn't really help them with a specific type of essay they have to do in my subject. So there's a big movement, for example, with Ursula Wingate is a leader of this kind of movement in the UK, that academic English should be embedded in the curriculum of the specific subjects. So I move away from general academic English towards, but this is problematic because it means then that lecturers in different subjects are then expected to take on responsibilities for disciplinary literacy in their own subjects. So how to write an essay in my subject, how to do this, so these are all big debates, and the idea of STEAM, which is kind of combining STEM subjects with the more humanities kind of subjects, you can get quite ferocious debates from one side or the other. I recently read blogs saying like STEAM is a disaster. It was tried in Australia, it didn't work. Other people coming out, fighting, defending this approach. So it's one of those big debates in education. And CLIL is in there in these debates, And but my take on it is really that CLIL in itself should be more sensitive to the pedagogies of the different subjects. But that's my particular take.
Thank you.
Sorry for the long answer or
No,
speech.
it's great. It's great.
I think it was very clear. Thank you so very much, Professor Tom Morton. I don't know if anyone would like to intervene. Anyone else? No. Well, if not, I would like to thank Lusófona's team for all the planning and organization of the event. Of course, a huge word of appreciation to our invited speakers, Professor Margarida Morgado and Professor Tom Morton, for providing so much food for thought, 100% for sure. A special thank you to Annabella for moderating and her wonderful work in the scope of our projects. Really, thank you, Annabella. Last but not least, thank you to all the participants. Hope it was a fruitful participation. It's not a goodbye, it's definitely a see you later. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now close the session. Thank you very much.